There's so much history in Wichita Falls. I love living here because every time I go anywhere, there's history attached to it, and especially our downtown area. So today we're talking about Gidgets, but what Gidgets has that nobody else has in town. So stay tuned. We're getting started right now. Hey y'all, welcome back. I'm Debbie Dobbins, your host for this episode of Your Wichita Falls. And I am a real estate entrepreneur, and on this channel we talk about all things Wichita Falls, from real estate to lifestyle to everything in between. And if you want to stay up to the minute on all things Wichita Falls, subscribe to our YouTube channel, ring that bell so you'll be notified every Monday when we upload a new video, and sometimes in between. So the next time you're in Gidget's Sandwich Shop, which actually is one of my favorite places in town to eat, bar none, check out my video on the top homegrown restaurants because it's right in there, and there's a great backstory to Gidget's and how it started. But way back 100 years ago, there's an even better story about
Gidgets.
Location. Not the sandwich shop, but the location. You might notice when you're in Gidget's having lunch that there's a door that leads to a place, and there's an old vault back there. And this is the location of the very first bank robbery in Wichita Falls. And the story is remarkable. So the one thing I love about Wichita Falls is its history. And there is so much of it. So I want to start this series about the historical buildings in Wichita Falls. And we're starting with Gidget. So we start in Burke-Burnett. For those of you that don't know about Burke-Burnett, it's a city just north of Wichita Falls. And the city was actually named after Samuel Burke-Burnett. For those of you who watched the show Yellowstone, Burke-Burnett was one of those ranchers, just like John on Yellowstone. He originally ranched cattle. His land holdings could have rivaled the Dutton family on Yellowstone, one of my very favorite shows on television, and some of you watch it. But back in 1896, two ranch hands, Foster Crawford and Elmer Kid Lewis, worked the Burke-Burnett ranch. Now, Crawford had worked there since 1888 as a range boss and a bodyguard, and Lewis had only been in the county for about a year. He was a youngin'. They were well known in the area, very well known, as what could be referred to as restless cowboys, but they were troublemakers. They were causing trouble in Wichita Falls all the time. You know the type. Crawford was 35, and he should have known better because he was from a good family in McClellan County. He had a flair for expensive clothes. He loved his clap boots. And there's a whole story about clap boots that we'll do on another video, but it was very expensive. And he was a likable enough guy, but he just got drunk too often. And we all know people that drink too much, and they are mean drunks. Well, he was a mean drunk, and he liked to fight when he got that way. Bring anybody to mind? Well, go down to any of our local bars, you might find somebody just like that. Well, Kid Lewis was only 18. He was a kid. He was from Missouri, and he was out for some excitement because back then we had these ranches and the oil was starting to come about. And he was fleeing from Montana, but he hatched some trouble wherever he went as well. He'd been in the county about a year at this time, and these two became members of the notorious, at the time, the Al Jennings Band. They didn't call them gangs at that time. They didn't call them gangs back then, but they sure were. They managed a little scrappy living doing holdups and such. It was their side hustle, doing these holdups. But they were sort of entrepreneurial in that respect because they did this contract work. Well, just getting by wasn't enough, right? These little holdups, they weren't producing quite enough for them. So they cooked up a plan to make a big haul by robbing the City National Bank of Wichita Falls. Now, the City National Bank, as we are going to find out, was in the very location where Gidgets is today. And so imagine when you drive down there and you see downtown, there's some landmarks. I've done a video on the world's smallest skyscraper, and so watch that video, or you can drive down there because that plays a little part in here. But these boys, they were not very secretive about their plan. You know how people get, they drink, they're boisterous, they're talking. Here comes into our story J.A. Kemp. Now, I've done stories on the Kemps and the Kells. The Kemps owned the bank. J.A. Kemp at the time was the bank president, and he had persuaded the governor to send the Texas Rangers to protect the bank because these boys were talking all around town of how they were going to rob the bank. I mean, we were a small town. We're still a small town, but we were super small back then. And so Kemp calls up the governor and he says, send the Rangers down. These crazy boys are going to rob the bank. And since these boys were aware of all of this, they decided to lay low until the Rangers got bored and decided that they were not needed any longer. I know that you couldn't write this story. The crazy part was Crawford and Lewis were the ones who saw the Rangers off to the train station when they left. Feels like a bad soap opera. They then proceeded to spend the night in a dugout on the east side. So the east side is the side across the tracks. So they hung out in the night on the east side. Well, as I said, they were talking. The residents had heard the rumors about the robbers because they were talking it up so much, and then everybody was telling each other. And they tried so hard to warn the community. This was about to happen. Guess what? These warnings went unheeded. And after the Rangers left, remember Crawford and Lewis drove them to the train station. After the Rangers left, Crawford and Lewis rode down the alley east of what is now the Holt Hotel. They dismounted and they waited until 2:30 p.m., right in the middle of the day. They walked to the bank at 7th and Ohio, where Gidgets now stands, and there were only 4 men in the bank at the time. Frank Dorsey, the cashier, Dr. Kendall, who's the vice president, who was chatting with Dorsey, P.P. Langford, the bookkeeper, and John Nichols, the only one that did not get hurt during the robbery because things did not go well. People say that Nichols was so thin, he took refuge in an ink bottle, so apparently that's how he got out of not being hurt. But Kemp, the president, coincidentally, or planned, not sure by the boys, was away on a trip with the railroad president. The other employees were off doing bank business, and there were no customers at that point. So, set the scene. There they are, 2:30 in the afternoon, 4 people in the bank. They enter the bank, and upon entering, Crawford cries up, to the bookkeeper, J.P. Langford. And when Langford failed to comprehend, because he didn't know what was happening and he didn't even understand what he was saying, Crawford struck him in the head with his gun. He pistol whipped him. This caused the gun to discharge. Obviously, Crawford was not that much of a brilliant person. And the gun discharged and it exploded and a bullet landed in the ceiling. Lewis had covered the cashier and one of the directors, Dr. Kendall. Upon hearing Crawford's gun explosion, he opened fire on the cashier, Frank Dorsey, because he was, he didn't know what he was doing, so he starts to fire. Dorsey fell to the floor dead right then and there with a bullet in the shoulder and one in the head. Then Lewis aimed a shot at Dr. Kendall's heart, but the bullet, you can't write this stuff. The bullet struck a pocket where he was carrying a hypodermic case. I'm not sure what that was for. Obviously he had some sort of ailment. But he was stunned and he fell to the ground. It didn't kill him, but he pretended to be dead because he'd already seen what happened to Dorsey. Not gonna go on with this. This guy's crazy with a gun. So Langford, following the hit on the head, was, because, he pistol whipped him. He was crawling to the back door when he was shot in the fleshy rear of his butt. And he got to the street and gave, he shouted the alarm because, there was only 4 people. One of them's now dead. One of them's laying on the ground pretending he's dead. And the other one was, he was so thin he was now in an ink bottle. And this guy found his way and pulled himself into the street and set off the noise to the group. He shouted to the people, there's something happening here. So in the meantime, Crawford was trying to collect all the money. So picture all of this happening in this bank, and Crawford is still trying to figure out, how am I going to get my money? So he's collecting all the money he could find. The bank vault was not locked, but the latch gave him trouble. Sorry, the story. It's almost too unbelievable to be true. So, you can imagine he's trying to get the door on the vault open, and he's having trouble with the lock. And so they just abandoned it. They scooped up the contents of the cash drawer, about $410, put it in a paper sack, and overlooking the next drawer, which contained about $1,000. These were not smart thieves. So they got away with about $410. As they dashed out of the back door of the bank, they pushed aside this unarmed J.D. Avis and went into the alley by the St. James Hotel where their horses were waiting. So their getaway car were their horses. They passed the vacant lot next to the bank, right there where the littlest skyscraper is, and Frank Hardesty, who's the deputy sheriff at the time, fired, severely wounding Lewis's horse. Not Lewis, his horse. Crawford fired back, but the bullet became embedded in Hardesty's watch. I'm sorry, it's too good to be true. The 2 robbers rode as fast as they could to 8th and East to Holiday Creek. Twice during their ride to the Thornberry area, so for those of you that know the area, the Thornberry area, they changed horses finally. They changed their getaway cars. The first exchange of horses was taken from William Neal, who was a truck farmer. He was driving with his wife to Wichita Falls. Fred Crane, a railroad man, witnessed this exchange. The 2 worn-out horses were exchanged for some farm animals. Then Crawford crossed a river near the Knott Farm, jumping their horses down a 15-foot bank. These poor horses. And their pursuers were still on the other side of the river. So they attacked 2 Bohemian farmers plowing in the fields. They exchanged their horses again. And finally, upon arriving at this little thicket in Thornberry pasture, the robbers dismounted and they attempted to escape through the underbrush. Meanwhile, this posse, I'm telling you, the posse in Wichita Falls was brewing, and they were mad. They were looking for a hanging. It grew. They were on a mission now. It's time for the people from the town to get involved. And they had people from the town, countryside. They all pulled together, and Crawford and Lewis were now on foot and surrounded by this hostile posse because they were there for a mission. They refused to surrender, however. Crazy boys. Rangers finally surrounded them because the Rangers came back. And after much yelling back and forth, the 2 robbers asked if they would be protected if they surrendered. Even in today's world, it's sometimes scary to know that you probably won't be. But guess what? The captain of the Rangers promised that they would. It was clear, however, that the crowd wanted to lynch them right then and there. The Rangers and the sheriff brought them back in a wagon to Wichita Falls. They put them in, this gets better again. They put them in the women's part of the jail, as those were the only keys available at the time because the posse had them and they hadn't returned them. I'm telling you, I'm not making this up. The Rangers stayed the night in jail as they felt there was a lynching about to happen, and they were not wrong. So the mob spirit began. Well, this is not my favorite part of Wichita Falls as far as this next part of the scene, but it's what happened. The mob spirit had taken over, and Dorsey, the gentleman from the bank that got shot, was such a beloved member of the community. His memorial in the newspaper was just incredible, and so I posted it because they went on and on and on about what a great guy he was. That's why the town was so upset. The mob finally basically took the law into their own hands. And the poor sheriff, he tried to keep order. The district judge warned that living with murder on your conscience was for a lifetime. The crowd was having nothing to do with it. They could only see that he had shot one of their very, very favorite citizens. And so basically the mob wasn't listening. The story goes that the mob finally battered down the jail door. The sheriff really didn't give much resistance, or at least that's how the story goes. And the two robbers were hauled off to a nearby telephone pole. The rope was thrown over the pole. The men stood on wooden boxes, which were kicked out from under them. The whole thing took less than an hour, and the memory will last forever. As much as I'm laughing and saying some of these things are crazy, that is part of our history, whether it be the littlest skyscraper or the oil boom or, our first bank robbery and our first hanging. There were attempts to charge the vigilantes with murder, but somehow or another, they became lost in the system. And there was never a trial. The robbers were buried in a casket. This is another crazy one. Buried one in a casket that his father purchased, and the other robber was buried in the casket box, the box that the casket came in. They were both buried in paupers' graves that you can still see today in Riverside Cemetery. It's just one of those stories that is part of our history. Not proud of the mob mentality, but that's exactly what happened. So the history of Wichita Falls continues, and if you go to Gidgets, just remember that you are sitting in the location of the first bank robbery of Wichita Falls. And enjoy your lunch because it's a beautiful space. I love Gidgets, can't talk about it enough. And if you want to know more about Wichita Falls, there's 2 more videos coming up. I encourage you to stay. Subscribe to our channel, learn more about the history of this amazing community. And if you want to ask me any questions or schedule a Zoom call with me, check out the first comment below. There's a link to do that. And as I always say, you all come back now. You hear?